Welcome to the Mindful Healers podcast with
Dr. Jessie Mahoney
and Dr. Ni-Cheng Liang.
We are here to help you learn to pause and be present, awaken your breath, and harness the ripple effects of mindfulness for radiant health.
We get you. We know you. We are you.
We have both been successful on the surface, yet struggling underneath. We have both had cluttered brains, been overwhelmed, and exhausted.
We're healers who have found solutions and want to share them with you.
Join us here to discover a better way.
Welcome to our podcast episode on It's Okay to Trust Yourself and the Process. A reminder that our podcast is not medical advice.
Our intention in this podcast is to raise the possibility of trusting the process and trusting yourself. Who knows better than you what's right for you? We hope you will discover the cost of not trusting. Not trusting yourself is self-doubt and leads to fear and anxiety, leads to imposter syndrome, leads to compare and despair. All habits that are very expensive, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. 3 takeaways from today's episode. Overthinking is a sign you don't trust yourself. It's possible to stop making yourself wrong. And it's possible also to trust past choices, your loved ones, your colleagues, and your patients.
At the outset of this episode, I want to qualify this episode with the background and the reminder that in medicine, we are actually trained not to trust from the very outset. As medical students, senior residents, fellows, attendings, running teams, and consultants, I was always taught to double check, look at the objective data myself to confirm, one, that it actually exists, and to come to my own conclusions. And so this inherent distrust has been deeply ingrained. And because of that distrust, it's in some ways contributed to me being the conscientious, thorough physician that I am today, which of course isn't a bad thing, but it can be an exhausting way to live, especially when that distrust bleeds into other aspects of our lives. So this can show up in our children, our spouses, and then also in strangers, other motorists, for instance, fellow shoppers in grocery stores, all the way to our own healthcare team. And perhaps the hardest for many is to learn to trust ourselves. For some, due to the fact that there's been prior conditioning inclusive of trauma. I also want to point out that our lives are abundant with mindful opportunities to trust, and that we can choose where that trust can be given.
Your beginning there reminded me of trust and confirm. And that's what I was taught in training. Trust, but also confirm. And when I trained, we actually had to go, everything was on paper, and we would be held accountable as to whether not just whether we wrote the order, but whether the nurse gave it and was it marked in the med record. And yet that was their job, not our job. And so I think this idea of trust and confirm bleeds also into our struggles with toxic independence. Easier to do it yourself than trust and confirm, and over responsibility, that it was our responsibility. Other people's jobs were also responsible for that. And so it's interesting that this concept of trust, as you were talking, bleeds into so many things. It also bleeds into catastrophizing, because if we can't trust the process and we can't trust the universe, and we're always in this hyper vigilant, maybe I can't trust state of mind, that is highly intertwined with catastrophizing and urgency and a dislike of uncertainty. Makes sense that when we are trained not to trust, and even down to not to trust our patients, right? Patients report, or they deny, or they claim, rather than that being the truth. And so it's interesting to me that trust and lack of trust is really infused into all these nooks and crannies of medicine. We were also, taught not to trust our colleagues necessarily. And I think that that's gotten better over time, but generally, we don't immediately start out trusting people. And when I have done my relationship courses, so the Mindful Love and Parent with Presence, we also don't trust our loved ones. And many people talk about women married to male spouses, talk about how, they trust and confirm with their partners, and especially around childcare. And do they remember? And that's not necessarily healthy energy to bring into a happy, loving, and satisfied relationship. The other thing I wanted to bring up is that we often don't trust our past choices. So we jump into regret. And if a past choice led to an outcome that we weren't expecting, we throw ourselves under the bus and tell ourselves we made a bad choice and therefore we can't trust ourselves. Or maybe we took a job that didn't turn out well and therefore we can't trust ourselves. And yet maybe it's just learning about what you enjoy or what you don't enjoy. Or as was mentioned by a former client of mine in a previous podcast, maybe it's just that they weren't who you hoped they would be. Rather than an inability to trust your decision making, perhaps it's just that others were different than you thought. And it has nothing to do with your decision making. And so I think this is where we get really stuck on making right and wrong decisions. We feel like we can't trust ourselves if something ever went wrong. And I always like to offer that regret is optional and regret is expensive. And so realizing that we can trust that we made the best decision we could in the moment with the information we had and move forward from there. Because again, most of us as humans are incredibly trustworthy. We try incredibly hard. We are never intentionally trying to make a bad choice. So can we trust our intentions? Can we trust our efforts? Can we trust our brains and our knowledge and our wisdom to do the best that we can?
Aspects of our past choices contributed to the people that we are today. And more often than not, we were absolutely doing the best that we could at that time, but we don't have to let our past choices wholly dictate our future as well. So, can we trust that our future will be exactly what it was meant to be because of our inherent trust in ourselves and in processes and ultimately in the universe?
And as you said that, I had this little twinge of like, well, is it okay to just trust that everything will turn out okay in the end? And so it's that deep-seated training that maybe that's complacent and maybe something, we're often waiting for the shoe to drop or waiting for something bad to happen. And so just realizing that all of us have this deeply rooted inherent reaction and that it takes practice to unwire it.
The distrust is, I think, hardwired from our negative attention bias. So there's definitely a direct link between our default being distrust because of that trust is earned and is only given when it's safe to do so.
Well, and how do we know when it's safe? And I'm thinking about having a partner who struggles with mental health. I've gotten better over the years, but I used to always be waiting for the shoe to drop. When is something going to happen? Knowing that this is something that can wax and wane, like when is it going to get worse? And I often think in the fall, when the weather changes, often triggers people's mental health. And I see that with quite a lot of frequency. And so immediately I notice like, oh, daylight savings time is coming. And I get my, I won't say it's distrust, it's more anxiety, but it is also a lack of trust in the world and this sort of hypervigilance that comes when we don't trust that things are going to turn out okay, and or that there are things that are outside of our control are our responsibility. And then we think we can't trust when really it's just letting things that are outside of our control be outside of our control and being okay with things being outside of our control. and that not meaning that we can't or don't trust. So trust is one of these tenets of mindfulness that comes up. And I believe that trust is key to being present. And when we trust, we can relax enough to sink in and be present and be connected. And that distrust or a lack of trust is very disconnecting for many people. And it often keeps us feeling isolated. When we can't trust ourselves too, then we go into imposter syndrome, which helps us feel isolated as well. And so just noticing that when you trust and when you feel safe and secure is very often when you feel most present in a relationship. And so training your brain to start looking about where you can trust things is a really powerful tool. I also think trust is key for people who are transitioning. And I talk about transitioning well. And if you don't trust yourself, it's incredibly hard to transition well. And so trusting your inner wisdom, trusting that you know the best way for you. We are trained in medicine to look externally for external validation and for the right way. There's a right way and a wrong way. And I hear from a lot of people who are working on starting businesses or their own practices. They really want to know the right way, because in medicine, we were trained that there is a right way and a wrong way. And everybody wants to do it the right way, instead of trusting yourself and trusting your own wisdom and your experience, and realizing that when you're doing something new, you won't know how you did it until after you did it. And so I love this idea of, could you take a leap without requiring life to assure you that you'd be successful? Because what will you miss out on if you don't? And then trusting yourself, we often struggle with that. And so for me, hand to heart has helped me tremendously trust myself, connecting to the fact that I have a heart and I'm making the best decision that I can, slowing down enough to listen, and not looking outside of yourself for the answers, assuming actually that you have the answers within if you take the time to listen, rather than me assuming that you, Nicheng, have all the answers. It's pausing to think about what answers I have within, which doesn't mean that we don't get advice, but you can take other people's advice and filter them with what you know is within, and trusting your own inner wisdom and knowledge and your own just way of moving through the world. Because one of the things I learned in Master Coach training is that your way is the right way for you, and that there's and your way, Nicheng, is the right way for you. And so I think it's so beautiful to realize that we all have a very different way. So the first step in building trust is noticing where trusting worked out well. Our negativity bias, we always notice where trusting didn't work out well, where we made mistakes, where things turned out worse than we expected. And so I encourage you to even make notes or make a list, or at the end of the day, maybe where you practice gratitude, for example, you could make a list of how things turned out well, how you could trust a decision. What evidence do you have that you can trust yourself? For example, for most people listening to this podcast, you trusted that going to medical school was a good idea, and it served you well in some capacity, always, for sure. And so I think for me, it's really helpful to notice where I made decisions that felt that I just knew, and I wasn't really sure why, but I trusted myself and they turned out well. And sometimes they're a quick just knowing, and sometimes they're a very bumpy road, and it still doesn't mean that you can't trust yourself. Thinking about starting Pause and Presence, right? That's been amazing and bumpy. And yet it doesn't mean I trusted myself that I was going to figure it out. And so I find that looking back for evidence, many of you know that recently I went to Hawaii and house sat for another physician who was visiting family. And I just trusted that this was going to turn out well. And it was fabulous. And actually, I'll say this was not my old pattern. I would never have done something like that. And yet I had this beautiful experience. Similarly, a week prior, I agreed to give this women in medicine talk at a local hospital, and it needed to happen quickly. And I was like, oh, I'll just do it. And it turned out to be this fantastic experience, not just the talk, but the woman who reached out to me. We went to college together, although we hadn't spoken in years. And she's a flower arranger. And she sent me afterwards this amazing thing where you could arrange flowers yourself. And it was this whole mindful activity from a whole company that I had never heard of. And so I think sometimes you just start to trust yourself and amazing things happen. And the one other thing that came to mind when I was thinking, because I tried to think in my head, like, oh, where did I trust myself? And it turned out well. And that was with the Sagrada retreats. And literally, I was there in the spring of 2021, and I was like, I just want to do this. It's a great idea. And we were still in COVID and all of those things. And now I'm on retreat 13. And if I hadn't just trusted myself, I really had no evidence that it would work out. It just seemed like a great idea and it felt right. And so for each of you, you will be able to look back and find these moments where you made great decisions, perhaps choosing your spouse or having a child. Like, notice the times when you trusted yourself and you made a decision and it turned out well, because you will have tons of evidence in your life that you can trust yourself. We just shift our negative attention bias to where we can't trust ourselves. The one time we made a mistake.
I'll share my own personal trusting journey, particularly as a cancer patient. Some of you might not know that I was a clinical trial patient. And so there was a lot of uncertainty with being a clinical trial patient because I didn't know if I was going to get placebo or the actual study drug. But I trusted my healthcare team to care for me in the best way that they knew how. And I'm so grateful that I did that, because here I am 12 plus years later. Then there was the trusting of my gut with a career shift, moving from one institution to another, the one that I'm currently at, where that current institution has enabled me to blossom and innovate in ways that I didn't think would be possible necessarily. Trusting in my teammates in dragon boating, knowing that we're all trying our best to paddle together in unison, and my volleyball teammates, trusting that we will do our best to handle the ball in our favor when it is within our control. So I think in talking about negative attention bias, we can pause for a moment and think back to all the different times in our life where we have trusted ourselves, each other, the process. And I wager that there's actually many more times in your life that trust has enabled something to turn out just fine, better than fine, better than you expected.
Yeah. And I hear from sometimes people are like, well, I can't get to it, might turn out better. And I often say it just might not be as bad as you think it would be also. Your comments reminded me also of our previous podcast on decision making and the challenges that we have in decision making and trusting ourselves to make a right decision, and the training that we have in medicine that mistakes are dangerous. And so just realizing that edgy side of the right and wrong, I think can also help you trust yourself a little bit more. The other piece I wanted to bring up here is trusting others to know what's right for them. Because as I mentioned in last week's podcast, as we're recording this, we were talking about judgment. And we often judge other people's decisions, just like we judge ourselves harshly and don't trust ourselves. We tend to not trust other people to know what they are doing for themselves, particularly our children. And so I think just trusting that others know what's right for them. I'm thinking also of aging parents. They get to decide what's right for them. We don't get to decide what's right for them. And so I think this belief, trusting is honoring other people's authenticity and who they are, whether that be parents, children, teenagers. Our job is to keep our children safe, but beyond that, it is not to have them be a certain way. And so can we trust that they're figuring it out? I always like to think that about teenagers. They're just still evolving, and it doesn't mean you can't trust them. They're just on their own journey.
Trust is an act of honoring their autonomy.
Yeah. And I want to just reflect that that's sometimes hard.
Definitely, especially with our kids.
Yeah. And we don't have to like it either. We talked about accept and not like, and I'm thinking we can also trust and not like. It's a little bit like it. Trust is a version of acceptance. It's also a version of non-judgment. It brings in a lot of the other tenets of mindfulness. So I wanted to talk for a moment about how to grow trust. And I mentioned the idea of shifting your attention to the positive or even to the neutral, maybe where your decisions didn't turn out badly. But I also like to bring in this concept of what you practice grows. So you have to practice trusting and practice looking for evidence that things will turn out okay. And if one of the things I often bring up in Parent with Presence is that also our children have to make mistakes and learn how to solve them. And they have to go through bumpiness. And if we go through, and we talk about this in pediatrics as the snowplow parent, so that they never, we clear the snow and they don't have to have any of these experiences, they don't learn to trust themselves. And so by trusting that they will figure it out, even if it's bumpy and uncomfortable, and even if they make a mistake, it's actually a gift of believing in themselves. So trusting in our children is that gift of belief we've talked about recently. And so not only do we get to practice trusting, our kids get to practice trusting themselves when we trust them. And then there are some physical practices, and I've done a few recent yoga practices around the root chakra. And the root chakra is like the base of your spine. And there's a lot of sort of Chinese medicine and other approaches to medicine that really embrace the root chakra as your sense of trust and safety and security. And so doing yoga with that in mind, doing grounding practices, noticing how you feel grounded and ways in which you feel grounded, you can actually practice embodying this trust and embodying feeling a sense of trust, which can help you when you are not on the mat or not in a meditation space. And then a few other things that I often bring up in coaching are asking better questions. So instead of why can't I trust myself? You can ask, how can I trust myself? Instead of why shouldn't I trust myself? Why should you trust yourself? What evidence do you have that things have turned out well? What if it turns out better than you expect? Or what if it turns out not as badly as you expect? I think there's tons of ways to ask better questions. So instead of asking the question, what could go wrong? What could go right? The other thought that comes to mind when we are not trusting, we get into this hypervigilant, ruminating, anxious space. And asking your future self whether you would wish that you had focused on this and ruminated about it or worried about it tomorrow or a year from now or 5 years from now. We can also tell better stories about our past decisions. And we talked a bit about that. Tell a story about how you made the best decision you could in the moment. Or I think this is true of other people's decisions too, rather than judging them, how they made the best decision. How can you trust them? 99% of the time, the nurses do give the medicine that you ordered. And so you really can trust them. And I think that when we start to realize that there is evidence of trust and we tell stories that are true, you're not making up a story, you're telling a narrative, you're shifting your attention to ways in which you can trust, we begin to grow trust. The other thing is that we often get triggered by the discomfort of uncertainty. And when we're uncomfortable, we think it's a problem and we think it means that we can't trust. And yet often it's just uncertainty or it's an unfamiliar path. It doesn't mean that you've made a mistake. And so we often use that as evidence that we have made a mistake and we can't trust ourselves. So I believe that trust is this path to new growth, evolution, transformation, transitions, all of the things.
As always, we like to close our podcasts with some reflection questions for you. So, taking some time and reflecting, where has distrust arisen? And where have you trusted?
Could you trust the process? Could you be okay with uncertainty? Could you be patient and trust along the way? And could you let go of control a little bit and see what happens? So I will offer at the end that coaching for me has been one of the things that's very much helped me to build trust and really look at the thought patterns that I have led to this sort of habit of not trusting, and also getting comfortable with trusting, because I think we immediately jump into a hesitation. What if something bad happens? And so coaching helps you work on that mindset. But again, a reminder that mindfulness is also necessary, because if we don't have self-compassion for the challenges of learning it, and we're in that sympathomimetic overwhelming storm, we can't shift into trust. And so my invitation would be that a blend of all of those is what really helps you shift into a different way of moving through the world. And I imagine that most of our listeners would like to move through the world trusting and a little bit more at peace. And so I would love it if you join me for one-on-one coaching. If there's real personal issues that you'd like to work through this, Parent with Presence also gets at trusting your children. Mindful Love gets at trusting your parents. Transition Well gets at trusting your intuition and the process and your journey. And so I would love to work with some of you in those settings. And Nicheng and I would love to work with you at a Connect in Nature retreat next fall. It's not too early to sign up. We just had someone sign up last night. So we would love to have you join us and practice mindfulness and understand a little bit more about coaching and how it works. And if you would like to do something before then, you can join me at Sagrada for a week retreat. Many people actually come to all three of the retreats that I offer. So you can do them in any order. And we would love to meet you in person. And I will offer one last comment, which just came to mind, which is many people don't trust themselves to make a decision to invest in themselves and to make a decision to learn something new, and don't trust that they're worth it, or don't trust that something will work. And in fact, our medical training is literally to be skeptical. And so just to understand that you can trust yourself, listen to yourself, and just to embrace possibility is the beginning steps of trust. So thank you all so much for joining us today. We hope it has been helpful. We would love it if you would leave us stars and especially written reviews to help others find the podcast and learn from it as well. And stay on after the singing bowl for our mindful moment offering.
As always, if you want to declutter your mind, be more present, and start truly living your one wild and precious life, come find us at the mindfulhealerspodcast.com.
Work with one of us.
Work with both of us.
Start or uplevel your mindfulness practice.
Discover how mindful coaching can change your life.
Or even better, do both as part of our Mindful Healers programs and retreats. You can find links to find out more about our programs and join our communities at themindfulhealerspodcast.com.
Reach out and get started on your journey to a life better lived today.
The content of this podcast is not meant to be medical or life advice. If you choose to participate in our mindful moments, please do so safely. Welcome to this mindful moment offering. Inviting you to close your eyes or lower your gaze a few inches in front of you if it's safe to do so. Settling in, noticing the sensations of the ground beneath your feet, the support of whatever you might be sitting on. And next, inviting you to rest your attention on the breath. Noticing the breath where you feel it the most. Trusting that the felt sensation of the breath where you feel it the most is exactly where your attention can rest. Noticing if it's the breath at the nostrils, the back of the throat, chest rise and fall, or the inflating and deflating of the abdomen. Noticing where you feel your breath the most. Because this is your perception, this is your truth, this is your direct experience, and it's ultimately your choice. As thoughts, other body sensations, or emotions capture your attention, simply acknowledge that and bringing your attention back to the breath where you feel it the most. Hoping that you'll remember to use this simple practice of checking in with the breath to help ground you in difficulty, where we might gain some clarity and provide opportunity to trust our innate wisdom. Thanks so much for practicing with me.